The year is 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have captured a hefty amount of territory and are looking to solidify their base further by taking control of Midway. When captured, this would force the Americans to fight across the ocean in order to regain control. The main problem was that they knew it would not be given up without a fight, so a plan was set in place. The main objective was not to capture the island, but instead to bait out the Americans from Hawaii and destroy their naval fleet. The Japanese's naval arsenal for this consisted of 4 carriers, those of which being the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hira, housing approximately 220 planes, 11 battleships, 16 submarines, and an invasion force of ground troops and support. The plan was for the Japanese to launch an attack on Midway using their planes, thus informing the US that a carrier was within the vicinity. That would result in the US sending their carriers from Pearl Harbor in support to defend against the attack. As the US travels towards Midway, a surprise ambush falls into place. They first strike with their submarines, followed by their carriers, and finally finishing up the job with their battleships hitting their enemy with an overwhelming force. It is now June 4th, 1942. The Japanese prepare their carriers and they send their planes. Unfortunately for them though, the US had one major advantage that they didn't. And that is that the US knew exactly what the Japanese were planning. The thing is that the US naval codebreakers, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, had been able to intercept and decipher the Japanese encrypted communication. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to know what was likely to happen and at what time. With this information, a plan was devised for the US to be doing the ambushing rather than the Japanese. The American naval arsenal for this battle included 3 carrier ships, those of which being the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown. Now the Yorktown had just been in a battle of Coral Sea, so it was not in the best conditions, but still capable of going into battle. With each carrier, there are 3 different types of planes. There are the dive bombers that fly at a high altitude of 20,000 feet, and when preparing to drop their bomb attached underneath the plane, rotate at around a 70-degree angle and begin dive bombing towards their target. Using the plane itself as their aim, they then drop the bomb at around 200 feet from the target and then pull out of the dive. Then there are the torpedo bombers, and they are the opposite as they need to be around 100 feet above the surface and fly at a slower speed. What they do is when their target is within their crosshair, they can launch their torpedo bomb. To fly too high or too fast could potentially destroy the bomb when entering the water. Lastly, there are the fighter planes. Their primary job is to protect the bombers and ensuring that they are able to lay their destruction without being shot down first. Back to the scene, the Japanese had just launched their search planes to scout out for any US ships, but were anticipating on not locating any until after the attack. Half the strike team of planes loaded with ground terrain bombs were sent out and successfully bombed parts of Midway. As the planes returned, it was such a success that the second batch of planes were being loaded with the same ground terrain bombs and were going to be sent out. Everything was going according to plan until one of the scout planes had spotted and reported a US carrier ship from a location that was not expected at all. The Japanese would have to act quick from unloading and loading the proper naval bombs onto their planes in order to be able to engage. The Americans had positioned themselves in what's now known as the Point of Luck, just north of Midway prior to the Japanese advancement and in anticipation of them. A group of planes then took off from Midway after the bombing and began attacking the Japanese fleet. They made little impact and were taken down, but managed to delay the bomb switching from the Japanese bombing planes. Weather plays an important role in the outcome of this battle. Both ships begin to reposition themselves so that they are facing the direction of the wind. The carriers were divided into 2 sections, one with just the USS Yorktown led by Admiral Fletcher, and the other with the USS Hornet and USS Enterprise led by Admiral Spruance. It was time for the US carriers to launch their attack with the air conditions being perfect for flight. The US Hornet launches their attack sending their squad of planes that ended up going the wrong way under the assumption that there might be more carriers further north of the currently located ones. This is what is now known as the flight to nowhere, as the planes that continued on the route made absolutely no contact and returned later having done nothing. Although the 1st Torpedo Squadron led by Lieutenant Commander Waldron diverted from the instructed route to nowhere and independently flew to where he felt the Japanese were with those under his command. Lieutenant Commander Waldron's hunch was correct and contact was made. Being that he was only leading torpedo bombers, he had absolutely no support and resulted in a failed mission with no hits. Following this attack, USS Enterprise launched their batch of planes as well. Oddly enough, the torpedo planes being the slowest, they ended up arriving first and making contact. Sadly, the same scenario unfolded with no hits being made, and a mission failed for all the torpedo bombers, as all the planes were annihilated. One extremely key note to mention is that by this point, all the Japanese planes had to steep to the low altitude to destroy the torpedo planes. So that begs the question of where was their support? Well, as I had mentioned before, the carriers had repositioned themselves. The remaining fighters and dive bombers had ended up going to the old coordinates and were fortunate enough to locate the carriers on their own again. So after the destruction, the remaining support arrived. With the dive bombers being at such a high altitude, they were completely free to position themselves to destroy the Japanese carriers. The Kaga was the first carrier to go down and took the majority of hits from the dive bombers, while the Akagi managed to be sunk by only 3 dive bombers with some extremely well-placed shots. The Hira and Soryu watched in horror as half of their carrier fleet had just been destroyed. Then comes the Yorktown dive bombers from the other side, striking and destroying the Soryu before they know what's happening. Once the Japanese get their bearing from the recent attack, they go into full offensive mode, sending their planes to destroy any carrier they can come across. The USS Yorktown was found and substantial damage was done to it. The Japanese then returned to refuel and stock up, thinking that they had just sunk one of America's carriers. As they fly back in once again, they come across another carrier and unleash hell. Well, that second carrier happened to be the Yorktown once again, but managed to get effectively patched up and operational after the first strike. This would be too much for old Yorktown, and in due time, it eventually sank. Now, the Americans just finished refueling and stocking up their planes once again, and went out to destroy the final carrier. The Hiru was found and substantial damage was done to it, leaving it barely operational. The Japanese then decided enough was lost and began to retreat, leaving the victory for the US. They proceed to push further and destroy the remaining stragglers, but as night falls, instead of continuing to pursue, the US turns around and disengages. This is because of fear that the Japanese might intend on a night engagement with more reinforcements, but what had been accomplished had been more than enough in the US's favor.